Whenever we approach a subject, we have to consider three options. We paint what we know, we paint what we see, and we paint what we want to see. Now, in terms of painting what we know, that could be painting anatomy, even though we don't actually see it, we know it's there. When we paint what we see, obviously, we're trying to reproduce what we're looking at. And then when we paint what we want to see, that can be anything from doing, say, a fantasy illustration where you're painting a dragon or something that doesn't exist, and so we're creating it from reference material, or again, maybe some anatomy or things that we know. But also when we're painting just a subject that we're looking at, it may be awkward the way the person's sitting. It may not translate really well visually, so we paint what we want to see. Now, in terms of something like painting what we know, looking at the drawing, looking at the painting that I'm doing, it's a guy playing a cello. Well, the majority of his anatomy, most of his torso, and virtually all of his right leg that's on our left is covered up, and a good portion of his leg on the right, his left leg. How do you approach that? Well, even though I was working, as you can see, in big blocky shapes, still I had to have a knowledge and an understanding of the anatomy behind it. It's really difficult to approach a subject like this. It can get very confusing, very awkward, especially if you're working with figures, to try to paint a subject where a large part of the anatomy is covered up, especially in a real awkward way like this cello is doing. So you've got to have the legs coming out in the right place and not looking like the person's either got this incredibly long torso or an incredibly short torso. So having a knowledge of the anatomy that's back there is crucial to making something look correct, look realistic. Even if you're doing, as in this case, this is not a photorealistic painting by any stretch of the imagination. And yet, the world that I've created here, and anytime you do a painting, you're creating a world. And within that world, you have the option of creating the rules. And the only restriction is that once you create those rules, then you got to live by them, because if you violate them, then the viewer has no idea what's going on. So in this particular painting, even though again it's very loose, it's very creative with the color, nonetheless I have indicated to the viewer that within reason we're staying fairly close to realistic proportions. So if I were to get my proportions off, then it would be very disturbing visually to the viewer. Now, the way I originally approached the painting was I blocked in a silhouette, and on top of that silhouette, then I drew the cello. Now, even though I was doing just a silhouette, my knowledge of anatomy was informing the silhouette I was creating. So, I don't remember all the bones. I don't remember all the muscles. I know where they're at, but I don't study anatomy all the time. So, even though I had all of it memorized at one point, eventually I forget because I just don't do it all the time. But nonetheless, there's enough of it in my mind that I can come back, and when I'm drawing, I can know where things are supposed to go. So there's your painting what you know. So that's one portion. Now, painting what you see, well, I was looking at a photograph that I had grabbed from somewhere, and was doing this cello player, and that's of course what was the main focus, is the visual reference. But then there's also painting what you want to see. And in this particular instance, I didn't want the figure to be photorealistic. I didn't want his pose to be exactly what I saw in the photograph. I wanted it to be a little more what I envisioned as I went. And of course, the colors are completely subjective. And what I did there was I just took mostly 3 or 4 colors, probably a alizarin, or not alizarin crimson, I don't use that, but quinacridone magenta or quinacridone red, something like that. Probably phthalo blue and phthalo green. Now these are bright colors. They're kind of, sometimes I'll refer to them as day glow colors because they're so intense. But I use those as the base on which I built the figure, built the painting, and then I used sort of that yellow ochreish, cadmium yellowish background as a foil for the figure. And I stayed within that sort of color range that I stayed in range of that particular palette, so that even though the colors are quite strong and in some instances a little garish, still everything ties together and is unified, because if nothing else, it's just a limited palette. And that's one good reason to use a limited palette, is that even if you're using colors that are strong, you can still keep everything relating to one another, and no one area is going to completely jump off the canvas at you because that color relates to the other colors. And you can use each of those colors to modify and bring the intensity down. I've had people ask, well, do you use black? And I do use black. I just treat black like any other color. Black is really nothing more than a really dark blue. And if you don't believe it, mix black with yellow and then put some, lighten it up, and you got this wonderful, warm, earthy green. You can take and add red to it, and now you've got this wonderful, subdued violet. So treating black as just a super dark blue, you can't go wrong. But now if you start using it to try and tint colors, I'm not saying that's always wrong. It's just it can create sort of a muddy consistency that just sort of deadens all your colors. So in this instance, if I needed to go super dark, well, then just mix your colors. And believe me, if you mix yellow, phthalo green, phthalo blue, and quinacridone violet together, you're going to get a dark, dark color. And if I need a light, well, just add white to it. So that's what I did. And these are fun little paintings to do. Every once in a while I break out my oil paints and I'll grab some photographs, maybe something off the internet, maybe something I've got, and I'll sit down and just have fun and knock out some little figures like this. This is oil on paper. It's Strathmore's Bristol paper, 300 pound or 100 pound 300 series. And nothing special about it. It's a nice paper, but you could use any paper. I would suggest using a heavier paper, like 100-pound paper, so that it can just hold up to your brushwork. But my goodness, I've used copy paper, typing paper, and just paint it on top of that with oils. It won't wrinkle really too much because it's not like you're using water, which will soak into the fibers and cause it to warp and wrinkle. The oil, it'll sink in, but it's not really absorbing into the fibers, so you don't have to sweat that too much. But yeah, I mean, I love doing these little oil on paper studies. They're just so much fun, and they help you to loosen up. And once you get into doing something that's really, really tight, then it's fun to bring these types of techniques in, because you realize that you don't have to be as laborious in your technique to get a really tight painting. You can actually use loose techniques like this and get some remarkably detailed paintings. And most of my demos, I'm not going to sit there and do a demo of a painting that I do that takes a very long time. So I will take these techniques and I'll play with them doing demos. But if you look at my website and you see some really, really, sometimes really tight paintings, well, the techniques that I'm using here, these are what I use on these super tight paintings. So I thought you'd enjoy this a little bit. Again, the main focus of this was just sort of informing you about the ways of seeing. So you paint what you know, you paint what you see, and you paint what you want to see. So, okay, I guess that kind of wraps this up. I'll just let you watch the rest of it, and thanks for tuning in.